Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Dr. Matt Slaboch. Dr. Slaboch is an assistant professor in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. He is also the author of The Road to Nowhere, The Idea of Progress and Its Critics. Matt, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Thanks so much, Josh. I'm looking forward to seeing where this conversation goes.
I am too. This is really fun. I know we recorded about a year ago, and I'm still really sorry about losing that recording. Zoom was not with me after all. But I'm looking forward to revisiting some of that and also kind of updating that for where we are now. Before we get into thoughts about progress and the world today and the past, I wonder if you could share with us just a bit of your academic journey. It sounds like you've had some good fortune in finding a position, but I know you were on the job hunt for an awfully long time. I've seen several Facebook posts and really good Twitter posts about the awfulness that is the academic job market. So, what does the job market look like in the academy today?
The job market, as such, I would say it isn't one. There trends point to more and more academic jobs being of the contingent or temporary sort, or even a part-time sort, with faculty or instructors hired to teach a class here and there, but not hired um, hired on a long-term, full-time contract there. So tenure track positions are definitely becoming rarer and rarer, and I think at a lot of universities, it's becoming the norm, where the bulk of the teaching faculty um, are, again, contingent or part-time, which is going to mean, they're probably not benefits eligible positions there. They're precarious, and that's true not only in political science, which is the area that my PhD is in. I think that's true across the humanities and social sciences, and even beyond. So yeah, it took a while for me to secure this tenure track position. Graduated in 2016 with my PhD, and I'm just finally, but happily, starting a tenure track role in the fall at Arizona State. And I'm very excited about that. I think it's going to be a good fit for me. So it's not just a matter of having secured a tenure track position. I've truly been offered a position that I'm really going to like, and look forward to officially starting in. So yeah, but that question about the market there, um, you know, I tweeted or posted, some, you know, snarky updates about the lack of job postings, or the nature of job postings, where you're expected to maybe teach 100 classes a year for $10 an hour, at midnight, or something like that, across spanning chemistry to you know ancient Greek literature or something like that. The requirements or expectations are just becoming more and more silly and hard to fill, I think. So it is disappointing. It is lamentable. If your follow-up question is what is to be done, I don't know what is to be done, so don't ask it.
No, I was actually going to ask a potentially controversial question about whether you see is the difficulty there tied to the budget, or is it tied to the rise of the diversity, equity, inclusion industry, or is there some further kind of cause, or is this just part of what it takes to get in? And there have always been difficulties in getting into high level teaching. Is this just the new difficulty of getting the guild card? I mean, it used to be the dissertation, but now the dissertation is no longer that difficult to get through, but actually getting a position may be the newer level, or I don't know. I'm just, what would you point to as a maybe a couple of causes there?
Uh, I don't think it's that the dissertation has become easier to earn. I think if you look at trends in a lot of fields, history, for instance, is one of them. It takes longer to earn a PhD in history than it did in the past. So I don't think it's become easier to get that degree there. Uh, I do think expectations have risen. So the PhD alone is not going to get you a position now. There's maybe expectations of having published something already, maybe not even just one thing, maybe multiple things, and having taught classes in graduate school before even being considered for a tenure track position. I think the market has become more competitive as more people are pursuing their PhDs. Uh, and I do think what you mentioned about the rise of uh, DEI, I think it's not just DEI. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's the growth of administration in universities generally, and so DEI is part of that. But there are also, um, administrators not, associated with DEI initiatives who are doing other things on campus. And I think they have taken a lot of the resources that in the past would have been directed towards faculty. Um, those who bemoan the rising costs of education, though, should be aware that money is not going to faculty. So don't blame your faculty for living a lavish life, because in most cases that is definitely not the case.
I think in that sense, we're obviously in two different educational worlds. I'm in the K-12 space, and that's just some days it feels like it's a very different planet. But in that sense, I think it's the same is true. It's a lot easier to find funding to build a new building than it is to necessarily do a greater than normal cost of living raise for faculty across the board. Well, let's get to maybe a happier topic, and let's talk about progress. I'm really curious, how did you land on progress as an area that you wanted to study and you really wanted to explore?
So uh, kind of it happened to be an of the moment decision there. I actually entered graduate school thinking I was going to do comparative politics, so studying domestic government and politics of countries besides the U.S. and seeing how um, you know elections and judicial structures and um, parliamentary systems, function in places outside of what's most familiar to me. And I thought I was going to be studying comparative politics and writing a dissertation on comparative politics with a focus on Central and Eastern European nationalism. That's what I thought I was going to be writing about. But I had, as part of my background, my bachelor's was in political science and also philosophy, and I had those philosophical interests. And one of the philosophers who stood out to me as an undergraduate um, was Arthur Schopenhauer, who I continued reading, mostly kind of for leisure or for pleasure. Um, you know, Even after I wasn't pursuing any sort of degree in philosophy there. Um, and then just around the time it came to dissertation writing, there was kind of a noticeable um, shift in the collective mood in the United States, where in 2008, Barack Obama came to the presidency with near universal acclaim, and he had, of course, run on a message of hope and change. Both of those terms suggesting, a great future ahead, suggesting optimism. In his second term, though, his reelection was much closer, and there he had to defend his record, and in his speeches he was saying things like, anyone who thinks America is in decline doesn't know what they're talking about. And the reason he had to say things like that in his speeches, that anyone who thinks America isn't in or that America is in decline doesn't know what they're thinking about, is because a larger number of people came to view the American position as a more precarious one, and started seeing the prospects for the United States in increasingly more troublesome or worrying sense there. And so the collective mood of the United States became more pessimistic, certainly, than when Obama came to office. And I wanted to consider, all right, if people are becoming more and more pessimistic, what is that going to mean for politics here? And one of the steps that I took there was to see, all right, who in political theory has offered a vision of politics that is going to have something to say about what a pessimistic disposition or attitude or view of the future is going to mean with respect to politics. And what I saw was that in modern political theory, especially, there aren't a large number of thinkers whose political theories are built around a criticism of the idea of progress. Instead, most of the familiar names to us in political theory have their philosophies buttressed on some optimistic vision of the future there. So whether we're talking Kant or Hegel or Marx or Mill or the founders, people of very, very different stripes, their philosophies of politics tend to be built around some idea of progress there. And so again, my question was, well, what if we dismiss that expectation of progress there? What is that going to mean? And so again, it was kind of the moment, considering the collective mood of the country, and then I wanted to see what we could do there, how we could make sense of that. And I had at Indiana University, where I got my PhD, a very supportive advisor in Aurelian Kraiutzu, who was excited about this project and was happy to let me go my own way and see what I would find there. And that's a big deal to have an advisor who's going to go to bat for you and support your vision and give you the freedom to pursue your interests while still being able to jump in and offer suggestions there. So having found someone, political theorists, who I knew would challenge me to do better work. That's part of my drifting away from comparative politics and back into something more philosophical. There is having the right person at IU, and then having this, what I thought was a timely moment to consider a different topic that I thought was underexplored. So that was a rambling answer to your question there, but that's how I got there.
I think it's a helpful answer. It kind of helps us see. I think it's always interesting, like, why people do the projects that they do, and I think that's a great way to think about it. The support was there, the idea was there, and the timing was there. Change any of those variables, and obviously your book would probably, hopefully, still exist, but it'd be very different. Run us through just a brief version of kind of what you ended up finding, as far as how does our political vision change if we aren't actively thinking about progress as kind of the goal. Because it seems to me that certainly today, now we're talking now, obviously in 2022, the idea of progress is just seemingly ubiquitous. I mean, I want to ask you in a moment about your thoughts about the recent Dobbs versus Jackson case and in this context, but there's lots of assumptions that we should be progressing and assumptions that progress has a direction and that there's clearly a next step. But what happens if we don't have that notion of progress baked into our political vision?
Uh, so before answering the question of what happens if we don't have the idea of progress baked into our political vision, I'd jump back and say, what happens when we do have the idea of progress as part of our political vision? And that's typically how I start the chapters in my book there, is by looking
Mhm.
at those people or those thinkers or writers who do have some vision of progress and what that means for their political theories or expectations there. And then I turn to critics of those other people, those individuals who do have some vision of progress there. And what we see in the first substantive chapter in my book, the argument I make is that in German political thought, for instance, you have individuals like Johann Herder or Immanuel Kant who do have some idea of progress in their works, some expectation of improvement, betterment, uh, and there we mean, not just technological betterment, not just scientific betterment, but improvement in the moral realm, the political realm, in realms maybe extending even into something that's typically seen as subjective, like art there. So there is this belief in improvement and improvements that will build upon each other. But there's a shift away after Herder and Kant to figures like Johann Fichte and Georg Hegel. And what we see in that shift is an expectation still of progress and betterment and improvement in the future, but a clear answer of who is to bring that about. For someone like Kant, it's a matter of, opening up debate and discussion and having freer thought, and that leads to, some experimentation there. And through experimentation and debate of ideas, we can, try new things, tinker with this, tinker with that, explore alternatives to the way that we've done things, and that will lead to improvement. But for people like Fichte and Hegel there, the state takes on a more prominent role in their visions of progress there. So debate, discussion alone, experimentation alone isn't going to lead to further improvement and advances. There's a role for this entity, this political entity called the state, to bring about that progress that otherwise won't come there. And so that's one of the things I observe in German, in the trajectory of German thought, is that the idea of progress, runs on over the course of the late 18th century into the 19th century there. But what it means is that, the theorists there want to have some sort of agent that is bringing about that progress. And who do they turn to? The state and those who would run the state. And so when I bring in a critic of the idea of progress there in the German context, that critic, and Arthur Schopenhauer is the main critic I point to in this chapter on German thought, is someone critiquing the expectation of progress, but at the same time critiquing the idea that the state is the solver of all problems there, that we should um, expect from politics a solution to all our problems and solutions that are permanent and lasting. Schopenhauer throws those beliefs right out the window there and says that that's not something you should expect from the state, and it's dangerous to put that much trust in the state to bring about positive change there. He points instead uh, uh, not to the benefits that the state could bring, but the potential pitfalls of granting too much power and authority to um, some political entity to bring about that progress. And so that's one of the critiques of progress that we see is in Schopenhauer, but also in others that I explore in different historical and cultural contexts. I look to um, Russia and the United States as well. A lot of the critics of progress are at the same time critics of politics. They're tending to minimize political solutions to what they see as perennial problems that are just going to pop up time and again and can't be solved. So a lot of these thinkers are ones who are going to propose instead individual solutions to the trials and traumas that any one of us are faced with in life. Um, that's a pretty constant theme or refrain when looking through my book. There is you get a lot of thinkers who are worried about potential pitfalls of something that seems happy, positive, good progress. What's the problem there? That sounds, who doesn't want progress? And the people that I'm looking at, they're not critiquing progress. They would love if things were improving all the time, getting better all the time. What they're critiquing is the idea of progress, and I'm careful to phrase things that way. None of these people are critical of advancement or improvement. Who's going to criticize things getting better? What they're critical of is the notion that things will always be better, that we have a right to expect that things will always get better. They say no and ask, okay, if things aren't always going to be better, what does that mean? What should we do then? So they're critics of grand political solutions, which they think are going to fail because we're simply going to be revisited by certain problems time and again. Or if we solve a problem in one area, that just means some other area is going to see challenges arise. So I'll hold off
Oh,
there.
That's first really interesting, and secondly, really there's I have so many areas I've been making notes about where I wanted to kind of follow up on that. But I think, tell me if I'm understanding this correctly. It seems that a lot of the people you're looking at who are advocating progress have what maybe could be characterized as sort of a Hegelian view of progress, as sort of a stair stepping movement upwards through various mechanisms, but primarily driven by the state. Versus but there's definitely a guaranteed upward trend in various registers, and your critics aren't really trying to say there is no upward trajectory or there's no movement, but the kind of progress they're looking at is sort of a constant improvement while recognizing that there are going to be a multitude of problems that never end. And we're always looking to kind of make the best we can in each situation, but we're not looking for a grand solution that fixes everything. Is that a fair characterization?
I would say largely fair on the presentation of the proponents of some idea of progress. So maybe not all agreeing with Hegel in the
Sure.
um, you know um, thesis, antithesis,
Mhm.
synthesis. That's unique to Hegel by and large there. So maybe not that aspect of history, but yeah, the believers in progress tend to see that stepping stone, that stairway vision where there might be a blip. It might not be a perfectly straight, flat, smooth line, slanting upwards, but they see that noticeable trend in history and expect that further trend in the future. The critics of the idea of progress, I would say, fall into various camps that I try to demonstrate in the book. So you have on the one hand some critics of the idea of progress who just simply see like no pattern in history. There might be temporary advances, but those temporary advances are washed away by a moment of decline or decay, only to be followed up again by maybe some temporary advance, then maybe stagnation, then maybe more advance, then maybe more advance, maybe decay, maybe decline. But on balance, just no rhyme or reason in history. There, no identifiable trend. That's one vision of history that's prominently explored in my book. Another camp says there's no universal progress, there's no permanent progress in history, but there are patterns in history. There are, for cultures or civilizations, periods of growth, flourishing, and then decay and decline that follow patterns equivalent to like the changing of the seasons, where we see spring and summer and flourishing, and followed by fall, um, and winter, and kind of death and decay. There are some critics of the idea of progress who see history following those lines there, where there's steady growth for a while and then just as steady decay
Hmm.
or decline. So cyclical theorists there, who think civilizations are going to have their periods of flourishing philosophy and art and literature and culture and things like that, and times of great ideas and religion being important,
Mm.
followed by times of just bleakness that are inevitable. And then besides these thinkers or critics of the idea of progress who see no pattern in history, or who do see patterns that ultimately don't add up to permanent progress, they see cycles of growth and decay. There are some critics of the idea of progress who just take their starting point and see from that starting point just straight downwards there. No progress, just straightforward, inevitable, one direction decline there. So there's a mix of people kind of critiquing historical trajectories there, and arguing against progress-minded thinkers there.
Interesting. There's so much wrapped up in that idea of progress. I can hear elements of kind of Plato's transcendental, the good, that there's something that we're aiming at. But I'm also reminded of I recently interviewed a political scientist named Scott Yenner at Boise State about his book, The Recovery of Family Life. And he was talking about the importance of Aristotle's idea of a political regime for his thought. And it seems to me that progress seems, from what you're describing, I can put those two things together, that progress is really tied to a certain conception of a political regime, and that then the critique of progress is really a critique of that political regime that often has its own different regime, either they're trying to put in place, or different conception of a good that the critic is aiming for.
Yeah, I'd say I agree in large extent with that there. So again, to turn to the German case there, there is, I see, a steady trend in German thought there that sees an increasing role for the state as the solver of society's problems, and at the same time there is the growth of nationalist
Mm,
thought. So statism is one thing, nationalism a different thing, but I think those two grow parallelly in German thought there. And the critics of the idea of progress in the German case, whether that's Schopenhauer or Nietzsche or the culturally German but Swiss writer Jacob Burckhardt, um, critique that statist nationalist
mm,
vision of of progress there. In um, the Russian case, um, you know, by the 20th century, we're going to see um, a different vision of what progress entails there, and it's still going to be, in the end, a totalitarian government that is responsible for bringing about progress, but it's not nationalism as the
mm,
hallmark of Soviet thought there. That progress is tied to other concepts like equality, for instance, there, and who is going to bring about that equality. You know, the party there, and so yeah, then the critics of the idea of progress there are going to worry about giving all this power or authority to the um, party leadership, and can see plainly that
mm,
giving all that power is going to be detrimental to um, people there. As far as proposing alternate regimes, um, yes and no. Critics of the idea of progress, a lot of them, I think, don't have an ideal in mind
mm,
in terms of what the best political regime is. I think a lot of them instead see that there's kind of not a one size fits all when it comes to um, political structures or institutions or frameworks there. What works in one place or time might not work in another place or time. And so the critics of philosophies that do posit some perfect political arrangement aren't going to be people who
mm,
propose their own ideal political arrangement. They're critiquing the very notion that there is such a thing. So the critics of the idea of progress are going to recognize certain institutions or structures or frameworks as better or worse. It's not that these people have no preferences whatsoever, and they can recognize that maybe a politician or party or movement does bring about something good for a while, and they can recognize that alternatives have been responsible for bringing about bad
mhm,
changes likewise. So these critics of the idea of progress are still evaluating, still um, you know reflecting on what works and what doesn't there. They're not totally divorced from politics there, but they want to encourage us to step back and look to see what we individually can do to solve our own problems here. Because inevitably, if we put all our hope in political parties or leaders or activists, we're going we're going to be disappointed.
mhm.
Um,
That is certainly a true statement. I mean, I think there's nothing but disappointment if there's no political party that can serve the place of God. That just doesn't work.
Right.
Um, Let me ask. Let's bring this more into current events for a moment. I want to backtrack to 20th century, but um, as I'll drop this episode probably sometime in August or September, but we're recording the week after the Supreme Court released the Dobbs versus Jackson case. And that's, of course, sparked a ton of discussion and debate all across the internet and in print, and I assume in families across the country that are quite, it's become quite contentious since that overturned the Roe v. Wade decision. Now, it seems to me that there's at least two that this ties into progress, or at least different conceptions of progress. I'm in the camp that sees Dobbs versus Jackson as a substantial course correction towards a more constitutionally oriented Supreme Court and constitutionally governed federal government. But there seem to be an awful lot of people who have a view that this is a rejection of progress, that this is stepping back towards. People have said, I've seen the claim that this is restoring the Middle Ages for women, that they can't have easy access to abortion that's guaranteed by the federal government and so on. So with that in mind, I don't want to ask you for your views on the abortion debate. That's not my question. But I do want to ask, what do you make of our current moment where we seem to have such divergent views on the nature of progress and where that fits into our political life as a country?
Yeah. So yeah, I definitely see where you're going with this question, and I agree that a lot of the response that we've seen, especially on social media, and social media, of course, isn't real, but in the Twitter sphere, I've seen those same memes or remarks. One of the ones that I've seen is, be sure to turn your clock back 50 years before you go to bed, things like that, and that sort of rhetoric there. I think what's going on earlier, you said the idea of progress seems ubiquitous in our time here. I tend to share that view there, that this idea is still kind of around. I think we see that in the rhetoric or the phrasing of the so-called right side of history, with people believing that history does have some sort of movement from worse to better, that things are expected to improve constantly over time, that there's a direction in history. At the same time, though, we've got this, right side of history rhetoric and that. If you look to current polls, something like 3/4 of the country thinks we're on the wrong track in the U.S. And that 3/4 number is particularly high, but it's been for a couple decades now that a majority of the population has said the US is on the wrong track as opposed to the right track. And what I would like to see more from polling, and I haven't seen this anywhere, is to question people not as to whether they believe we're moving in a good direction currently, which clearly, a large majority of people think we're not currently progressing. I would like to see some pollster out there, and if any social scientist listening in wants to take this up, anyone with polling expertise wants to take this up, do people still share in some expectation that the future will be better, that next generation will be better than this generation, and the one following that will be better, and further improvement is something that we can expect in history despite this current moment where we're not progressing? Is this, dismissal of the idea that we're currently going in the right direction, an abandonment of the idea of progress entirely? I'm inclined to think no, it's not, that people still have that idea of progress, that's still part of their leaning there, in spite of thinking that we're not currently progressing. I think it's possible to hold the attitude or the belief that things are going poorly right now, but that doesn't mean they're going to go that way forever. It will get better over time. What does it mean that we have very different visions of progress in the United States? What does that mean? I think that's one of the issues with the idea of progress there, is that it's kind of a murky term there. Improvement, fine, but how you define improvement is going to maybe differ from how I define improvement. You mentioned your own position on Supreme Court and this particular case here, and you're going to see this as a move in the right direction, and you've acknowledged that a lot of people don't see it as such. So what does that do? What does that mean then? Again, I would point to the figures in the book who are critical of the idea of progress and tying progress to politics there. I think the critics in my book would be aghast at the politicization of everything that we currently see right now. We see that in companies taking stances on political and social issues here. They have to change their profile pictures to whatever the cause of the day is, and they reach out with marketing campaigns here, and you've got a cookie company taking a stance on this issue, and you've got a lawnmower company weighing in on whatever else. And I think any of these critics of progress that I'm looking at would say that's they'd maybe expect that this is where we would be, and they would again encourage go back. Don't make politics the be all end all of everything, even though there are of course major issues that are important and opinions that are deeply held. But there's something troubling about the fact that every election that I've been through in my lifetime has been the most important election of my lifetime. How can that be? Because we're ratcheting everything up into the a make or break moment there, instead of scaling things back. We are giving so much credence to political solutions there that when the wrong side has political power, it's cataclysmic there.
Well, I think it definitely, that rhetoric comes out. I'm sure we're bracing for more of it coming up with midterm elections later this year, and people have been planning for the 2024 presidential run as for about at least 2.5 years now, it seems to me. I think it's really interesting that this brings out the progress is a concept that definitely brings out people's ultimate convictions, and we see that in real time in a way, and like what people value in terms of where they put or where they kind of place meaning in the idea of progress, and yet at the same time it's such an amorphous term. I want to go back to your hypothetical polling. If someone is thinking of designing a poll, I'll add my wish to the list. I would love for someone who is really good at crafting qualitative questions on a poll to figure out how exactly to determine if people view progress as purely material or if there's a sort of way to have a more complex understanding of progress. Progress in terms of moral questions, political questions, social questions, even in terms of like friendships. Are we progressing in the number of good quality relationships we have that are conducive towards happiness? Those are questions I would find that data really interesting because it seems to me that most of the people I've heard who talk about progress tend to sort of collapse progress down to just the material and just the economic. And in that sense, it's very easy to see, well, obviously, there has been material progress and technological progress over the last 5 centuries. But there occasionally are moments that make me kind of think a little bit more deeply about it. I recently read Matt Walsh's new book, What is a Woman? It was a fascinating read. And in that, he closes that book with attempting to describe contemporary gender theory to Maasai warriors who live a very traditional lifestyle. And he kind of ends it. He's of course it's Matt Walsh who is he's kind of brash. He's not shy at all about just calling it like he thinks it is. But his goal in closing it there is to really highlight the West has grown in so many material ways, and yet here are a group of people who don't have that material wealth. They don't have the educational opportunities, and yet if you ask them, and he did, they say that they are very happy with their lives and they like the way they live, and they don't understand any of these complexities that we get in a snit over about who's a man, who's a woman, and can there be pregnant people? Does that sentence even make sense? It was a very funny section of the book, but it seemed to me to encapsulate some of the difficulties with this idea of progress, where we could say, oh, look at all this great progress, and yet there seems to be a cost, and it's really easy to somehow ignore that cost. So those are at least my thoughts in response to your hypothetical polling data. Any other thoughts on that?
Oh yeah. And yeah, so definitely there. And that is a common refrain of some of the people mentioned in my book, beginning with Schopenhauer in that first chapter there, who notes that advances in technology, for instance, which are readily apparent, don't necessarily correspond with any advances in terms of overall level of happiness there. You see development over time, fine. There is you know, material advancement, and there is technological improvement, but what in the past would have been seen as a luxury simply becomes a necessity. And there's still that feeling of lack or want that can't be satiated there. So more and more advancement in terms of technology and in terms of material goods, to what end would be the question there. When is the satisfaction ever going to achieve? It seems like it's always being pushed off to this generation has improved materially, so the next one will be the one that's happier. Well, we often find that that's not the case. Really, things are improving. People are getting more stuff. People have their iPhones there, or whatever their entertainments. But it is the net gain in happiness increasing as technology increases? Not necessarily so. And does technological progress always solve problems? No. Sometimes it introduces new ones for us. So, there, planes make travel easier, and they also make bombing entire cities easier. things like that. And so, these are not just negative naysayers who look on the dark side of life. I think they have real and legitimate criticisms of whether material improvements are the be all end all of everything there. And so the society you're describing as a happy one that has a traditional lifestyle, keeps doing things in a certain way, and isn't associated with certain Western views and is just totally unaware of those things. Um, that reminds me of one of the other criticisms of progress, of the idea of progress that comes in my book. Leo Tolstoy is one of those critics whom I look at, and part of Tolstoy's argument against the idea of progress is that it's going to be abused by governments, and particularly European governments, who are going to see their vision of improvement as universal and try to impose it on other people who don't share in it. And they're going to claim that it's for these other groups' benefit or well-being that European ways are being introduced, because it's going to help those people progress there. So Tolstoy ties the idea of progress to colonialism, for instance.
Well, I mean, that was the argument for, besides the whole Saddam Hussein might have been tied to 9/11, which he wasn't. I mean, that was a major argument about Operation Iraqi Freedom.
Sure.
We're going to go in and we're going to establish democracy in the Middle East, and it's going to be great for these people.
Right.
And I mean, and in one sense, it is. I mean, I still think the American presence in Iraq is a better thing than the alternative, but goodness gracious, that is still imposing. It's still using power to impose one vision of the world over another group of people.
Right. Right.
No. It's crazy. Well, Matt, before we wrap up our conversation today, I wonder if you could bring us into the present. Are there critics of progress working today? Is this still an active question that people are exploring? I don't know if you're also developing your own critique of progress, or just kind of looking at other people's critiques. But is that an active question of study today?
Yeah, I definitely think it is still an active question here, and I think others have similar, if not the same, starting point as I do, where there's a recognition that people, not just in the United States but around the world, these right track, wrong track polls, see the present in particularly bleak terms and are fearful of the future instead of looking forward to it. So I think there are a number of authors who are keen to investigate the idea of progress and wrestle with it there. And those people willing to interrogate the idea of progress kind of span the political spectrum there. So some of the loudest denouncers of the idea of progress come from the environmentalist left, for instance, there. And they have a particular concern that progress is defined chiefly in material consumerist terms there. And what has that meant? It has meant, the growth of industry and the growth of, waste on, plastics and disposable things there, which is having, a ruinous effect on the environment. So this group of people wants to stay, say maybe the idea of progress isn't a good thing if it's going to lead to the waste of resources and the ravaging of the earth there. So you've got that camp of people who are investigating this question of progress here. And then you have people who are maybe closer to, offering a critique like Tolstoy's, where they want to ask, is the idea of progress something that is universally felt? No, there are different beliefs in different parts of the world. So why should the rest of the world have to conform to Western standards there? So you've got a critique of the idea of progress that is a critique of Westernization or imperialism, that sort of thing there. So that's a camp, and then you do have critics of the idea of progress of maybe a more conservative bent um, who in William F. Buckley's terms, want to yell stop at the march of history there. So yeah, there are definitely people who are investigating and exploring the idea of progress and are willing to critique it. Whether I'm going to offer a theory of my own, no, it's not part of my agenda there. I'm more intellectual history as opposed to normative theorizing there. So you're not going to see a novel theory from me coming out anytime soon. I'm happier to explore and analyze and explain other people's critiques and see what they mean and hopefully shed light on those. But yeah, I think this debate is definitely not dead or settled at all.
Excellent. Matt, I think you've done a great job today clarifying and explaining these different views and the critiques of them, and helping our listeners to really understand this ongoing debate, which is, I always find it helpful to know that the things that we see in the world today are not original, they're not really new, but they're maybe the latest chapter in a really long essay that is being written across several centuries. Where can people find and follow your work online if they want to be sure to know about your next book or order your current book or essays you might write, things of that nature?
Sure. If people are on Goodreads, I'm on Goodreads. You can find me on Goodreads. If you're on the twitter.com, I'm there. So you can find me on Twitter. If for some reason you wanted to connect on LinkedIn, you could. I use LinkedIn pretty much as an alternative Facebook. I don't do a lot of business posting on there. I just make fun of LinkedIn on LinkedIn. But happy to connect with anyone there. Those who use academia.edu can follow me on that, or ResearchGate. I use that. So happy to follow back, of course, anyone who does follow me on any of these various social media platforms. So.
Excellent. Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Josh. It was good to talk to you again, and I think I say thank you to Zoom for erasing our earlier discussion, because I think this one, it gave us a chance to get together again, and I think it was fun. So
I agree, 100%. Well, thank you, listeners, for joining us today for this episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Dr. Matt Slaboch, visiting professor. I'm sorry, let me get the right title because we updated that after I wrote my sheet. Let's see. Let me start that conclusion over again. Thank you, listeners, for joining us today for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Dr. Matt Slaboch. He is the assistant professor in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, and the author of The Road to Nowhere, The Idea of Progress and Its Critics. If you like this episode, please leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. The Optimistic Curmudgeon is a project of Thales Press. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. You can find us on 3 major social media platforms. Search for The Optimistic Curmudgeon on Facebook and LinkedIn, and find us on Twitter at the handle @TheOptimisticC3. This episode was edited and produced by Madison Kay, audio engineer for The Optimistic Curmudgeon. Until next time, seek the good, pursue the true, and love the beautiful.